Just to introduce today's conference, I wanted to look back. We're 4 years into a series of financial crises which were dramatically marked by bear stearns and liquidity shocks in 2007. In fact, we had a lecture at Gresham College in 2007 in September on liquidity shocks. And then these were followed by the Lehman and RBS failures, the Irish and Icelandic collapses, and the Eurozone currency quakes. And there have really been no financial reforms yet to match the magnitude of the problems. So we're an Olympiad later, to use a Grecian phrase, and the phrases that I hear are that we are wasting a good crisis or kicking the can down the road. The world feels more brittle and people are jumping at any hint of another imminent pop in the system. Now bubbles, really sound lovely. Soft bath foam, socialist champagne pétillant, but they are lethal. Real economies make poor decisions that waste people's jobs and lives. And if bubbles are froth, then froth sure hurts. In 2007, inspired by the 10,000-year clock of the long now, the Long Finance Initiative took a 100-year time frame to explore an impertinent question: when would we know our financial system is working? Bob Giffords and I wrote the paper, The Road to Long Finance, A Systems View of the Credit Scrunch, and we explored the bubbles that led to the crises, arguing that leverage and regulation lead to more risk rather than less, and that banking competition should be at the center of the debate. And with support from Gresham College, the City of London Corporation, and many others, including our hosts, HSBC today, we consistently return to two themes. Those are the need to link economics with communities and the nature of money. Now, we've organized and supported over the last 4 years over 100 free events, posted over 200 reports, and argued for big reforms such as confidence accounting, pension indemnity insurance, standards market financial regulation, index-linked carbon bonds, utility banking, and new monies. During all of this, two long-term investment scenarios recur: population growth and resource scarcity. And Bank of America Merrill Lynch hosted our spring conference on prosperity and scarcity. And last year, and I think several of you in the audience were there, when we had 350 people singing about financial reform with Brian Eno in the Willis Center. For those of you who weren't there, sadly, there's a video online for you doubters. Now, HSBC hosts today's Bubble Trouble, this autumn conference. Now, people who work in financial services are developing some deep reforms, but we're increasingly wondering if the status quo, our trade bodies, our politicians, and our media, are really out to just stymie them. At this year's Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment annual conference, Alderman and now Sheriff Alan Yarrow said, "We are living in a cloud of risk aversion and mediocrity." The first 4 years of responses to the financial crisis have been a cloud of committees, councils, conferences, conclaves, and one independent commission on banking, all to thunderous inaction. And scarily, to uproarious objection at the time in 2008, I mentioned that the financial crisis of 1929 didn't result in any genuine reforms until 1933, 4 years later. So as another status quo points out, perhaps I've been a little dreamer. Now, all these reforms contend with the battle between the right answer and the status quo, but so far, the art of the impossible seems to have won. Despite repeated bubble pops, we are more prone than we were in 2007 to boom and bust, in my opinion. And rather conveniently for the UK status quo, the press released the pressure for genuine reform by shouting sovereign debt crisis or euro crisis instead of actually yet another banking crisis. So is it modesty that prevents us suggesting hundreds of new banks or mutuals, portable account competition, zero leverage banking, all things considered and really parked by the ICB? At the moment, Occupy Wall Street is occupying our short-term attention as it extends its franchise around the world, having recently arrived at St. Paul's. Perhaps the long-term good will come from this and their protest movement. I was encouraged to hear the Bishop of London invite investment banker Ken Costa, my successor as Mercer School Memorial Professor of Commerce at Gresham College, and former chair of UBS Europe and Lazard International, to spearhead an initiative reconnecting the financial with the ethical. But complex technical reforms are essential too. We need to address why long-term money supply growth exceeds GDP growth, and what is the public benefit of highly leveraged banks. Today, John Redwood MP will address the root problems with fiat currencies, inflation, government finance, and the search for extra spending. Later, we will be exploring whether bursting one bubble leads to another and whether green finance might be a bubble in the making rather than a planetary savior. Short and long, we need both types of discussions about reform. And I like to contend, somewhat controversially, that without real reform, London may be the big loser. The Germans would write their own EU directive after a manufacturing crisis. The French their own after an agricultural crisis. I think a London directive would have each of the various financial services, banks, auditors, rating agencies, exchanges, clearinghouses, propose one genuine EU reform they would support to make financial services better or more robust. Banks on competition or leverage, auditors on indemnification, rating agencies on Basel, exchanges on high-frequency trading, clearinghouses on OTC. Yes, Brussels has had daft ideas on offshore centers and hedge funds, but surely Londoners can't fail to have noticed the scale of financial crises surrounding banks. As the leaders in European and global finance, can't we say sorry? And our trade associations do. They say, no, Brussels, sorry, what was the question? Developing the London Directive to me would be true leadership, because I think that admitting you need reform is the first step to recovery. So let's have a quick look at today's program. We'll be having, as always in long finance, two presentations and two panels. John will be kicking off, and then we'll be having a panel sit down to discuss bubbling fourth or fifth. Those of you who hate puns are probably already reeling. And then after a short break and coffee, we'll have John Elkington talking to us about initiatives going on in terms of beyond bubbles, and we'll have our second panel. As ever, after the panelists have their sort of quick 2 minutes to make one big point, we hand over to you, and it's your participation that has made the 11 or 12 events we've had in the past really quite a success. So to keep things on schedule and underway, I'm going to turn to John Redwood. John Redwood, as you're aware, needs no introduction, really for two reasons. One, the man himself, and two, his biography is contained in your packs. John, welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for that warm welcome. I'm not here as a Conservative MP, I'm here as John Redwood, perhaps best defined as the author of johnredwood.com, which tries to provide a daily commentary on the follies, foibles, successes and failures of the financial and economic world. And there has been plenty to write about in recent years. Our topic is, will there be more bubbles? And yes, there will be more bubbles. If you miss the last one, worry not. There will be another bubble along anytime soon. And there are certain characteristics which bubbles have in common. There is often a banking and a financial base to the bubble. There are the sinews of the bubble, the money that's pumped in. But there's also a psychology. And we see that the psychology becomes addictive. A limited number of people start off with the good idea of ramping a price. And if they're really successful 3 or 4 years later, they've ramped it beyond riches and dreams of avarice. And suddenly all the books are rewritten, justifying why this price has been singled out and why it's gone up. If we had been meeting in 1638 in Amsterdam, we would be discussing how serious the collapse of the tulip market might prove. Because by about 1637, one of the then recent bubbles had developed spectacularly, and a series of wealthy merchants and enterprising people in that very successful mega entrepot of the day, Amsterdam, had decided that tulip bulbs were the most prized way of displaying and keeping their wealth, and they had built a mighty market. They had pioneered some of the techniques we've got used to, if not to love, with forwards and futures, so that they didn't even have to take delivery of the individual tulip bulbs because they were so valuable. There were security problems with them, and so why not trade a piece of paper? And that very elaborate development then, of course, was confounded, and suddenly people said, but these are just tulip bulbs. They just grow into flowers and then waste away. Why are we treating these as a great store of value? And the bubble burst. There are some modern historians who said it wasn't a serious bubble at all and not too many people lost too much wealth, but I prefer the original story. I think it was one of the early bubbles. And why it's so good is, to us, it seems quite preposterous that people could think that tulip bulbs were a good store of value, because they haven't been subsequently. I don't go to my neighbours' houses and find a treasured tulip bulb in a glass case in a prominent position in their reception room, because we no longer think they are magic. We might have a few in a dirty pot in the kitchen, but they're not worth very much. That one did not come again. But some other bubbles do come again. And we think that gold has great value. It's not a very useful metal. Some people think it's very pretty, others are not quite so sure. But that does come again. There are waves of enthusiasm for gold. And gold, of course, its proponents say, is much less bubble-like because it's really money. Some people think it's the only true money because it has often been used in money systems in the past. And until 1971, it was still the core of an important part of the paper currency world, which grew up in the 20th century. So we see that perceptions change. Psychology is an important part of it. What people think is valuable or matters has an impact. Towards the end of the 1980s, as a very young man, I hasten to add, I went to Tokyo. And I was there before people thought that Tokyo property prices were excessive, and before they thought that Japanese share prices were excessive. The Japanese stock market peaked out at the end of 1989 at an index level of just under 40,000. It is currently today well under 10,000, so more than 3/4 below where it was 20 years ago, and it has never got anywhere near 40,000 over the ensuing 20 years. That is a pretty good bubble. People made good money. If they remembered to get out, they then lost a lot of money. If they didn't, and those who came in near the top were, of course, burned extremely badly because they just had the unpleasant downside. When I was there was euphoria in the air. And the psychology had changed. Everybody who was a serious commentator thought that Japan was going to knock the United States of America off the top perch. They were so impressed by the dominance of the Japanese industrial and trading companies, so impressed by the size of the Japanese banks, so impressed by the luxury, quality and price of the Japanese property market, that they were quite sure that Japan was going to topple America. If anyone looked at the population figures, it required quite a leap of imagination to think that the Japanese economy was going to become bigger than America's, but it was mood, it was sentiment, it was emotion. They knew it was going to happen. America looked rather silly. America was old, tired. The president didn't seem to be communicating the right message. The American president went to Japan and made a mess of it all, and the Japanese were extremely impressed by their own success and by their relative strength. And in the course of my discussions and meetings, I was driven past the quite extensive grounds of the Emperor's Palace. And my Japanese host said, "You see that piece of real estate there?" He said, "Well, of course, I'm a good, loyal royalist, and the Emperor is going to live there in perpetuity, and it's wonderful to have it in the centre of Tokyo." But he said, "Just imagine if it were a development site." He said, "That site, the Emperor's Gardens, would be worth more than the state of California." Now, he was a very friendly Japanese, and I didn't wish to insult him, so I waited until I got back to the UK Embassy amongst my own advisors, and I then gave the quip I wanted to give to my Japanese host. And I said, "I think it's time to sell the Emperor's Palace and to buy California." And if only one had been able to do that switch, that would have made me an extremely rich man. But I, of course, was not allowed to do anything at the time, so I quite properly didn't. But it was such an obvious moment. It was as if they rang a bell at the top of that market that you had people saying these extraordinary things. And of course, the next decade threw up the next bubble. And the next bubble was, of course, the technology companies of California. So that made the switch even more dramatically good, because whilst the real estate prices of Tokyo were crumbling from almost the moment that comment was made for the next 20 years, suddenly, towards the end of the decade of the 90s, the industrial real estate of California was being bid up, because America turned out to be the future, not the past. America turned out to be the aggressive applier of the digital age rather than the failing superpower who was being outclassed by Japanese excellence and industrial might. And it was, again, moods. Suddenly the markets said, "Goodness, we missed this in the late 80s, early 90s, but what really matters is technical, innovative capacity." And America is onto something here. She's gone digital. Japan can't do digital. Japan has rather restricted capacity for thought and self-criticism. Japan proceeds by very small incremental moves, and in the end has to copy the great blue sky advances that only the Anglo-Saxons are capable of. The Brits are capable of them and give away the commercial application, and the Americans are good at not only developing them but making money out of them. So we had the phenomenal dot-com bubble. The Japanese bubble was one of the most spectacular ever. I mean, some people say that a square metre of prime real estate got to $1 million in the Japanese bubble. And again, how could people believe that that was feasible, realistic, or sustainable? But they did, because it was the mood, because Japan was going places. Everybody needed to be in Tokyo. And if you were anybody, you needed to be in that really prime piece of real estate in Tokyo. And if you couldn't have the Emperor's Palace, you had the next best thing, and they knew the districts, and they were the ones that went crazy. The markets then did the same thing to American technology. And towards the end of the 90s, we had this spectacular boom in the Nasdaq, and people writing these stories about the four horsemen of the Nasdaq. They should have thought through the nature of that image, because those horsemen didn't always bring good news, I seem to recall. But in those days, the four horsemen, they were there, and they were going to storm around. And they got so excited by the idea of the digital revolution and by the internet age. And in a way, they were right to be excited about it. They forgot all their common sense about business. Just as people in Japan forgot that there is no credible business you can run out of real estate at $1 million a square metre because your customers can't afford it, so people at the end of the 1990s forgot that you cannot build a business out of hope and excitement. They were literally setting up South Sea type companies, the granddaddy of them all, which I haven't got time to mention. But they were setting up businesses to do things on the web, to be defined or to develop after you had parted with your money. And I remember reading a book explaining to me how old-fashioned I was, thinking that businesses needed customers and revenue and cash flow and preferably profits. And it said, no, we haven't got time for all that. You raise the money, you explain the concept, and you burn the cash. And they had serious analysts writing articles about the cash burn rates of these companies, not to say that you shouldn't go anywhere near them until they'd stop burning the cash, but to say, you know, this one's got a year's cash burn and it will probably work, so let's just go for it. And people paid ever in crazier multiples, indeed all the multiples were infinite because there were no profits, in order to get into these strange companies. Some 10 years on from the crash, we now know that the broad idea was right, that the internet is a revolutionary and dynamic technology, and it will be possible for some people to make a lot of money out of it, and it's necessary for all of us to use it as a business tool, so there are big revenues. And we now know that there were some winners from those heady days. Some did manage to burn their cash sufficiently intelligently to build a lot of supporters on their list and then to make those supporters pay. Others are still finding it difficult to make the transition from having thousands of people or millions of people signed up to their website to actually getting them to pay for the privilege. And we see the sort of tragic struggles in the media industry at the moment over whether you can get people to pay a realistic price for what has been free goods so far on the web, which you were prepared to pay for if it came in the printed form on paper. So we saw there a bubble which was half right but catastrophically wrong. And after 2000, you had this enormous collapse in the share prices of many. You had maybe about half of them going bust, so people lost all their money in them. And the Nasdaq fell back from a very, very high level, about 5,000, to a fraction of that, and has stayed at a fraction of it ever since. Now, we're interested today in whether we're still in a bubble, and if so, what might happen to that bubble. And you've particularly set me the scholarship question of, does one bubble lead to another, which I found out when I arrived, so it's always a nice challenge. And I think there is a serious problem that one bubble can often lead to another. And if we look at this long credit crunch, I think it's all the same crisis. We may well be in the euro sovereign debt phase of it at the moment, or as our former speaker said, it's still part of the same banking crisis, different assets going wrong. But I think you need to go back to 2004, 2005 with the build of the original bubble to try and understand where we've now got to as the crisis evolves, because the bubble hasn't been completely punctured. Parts of it have, parts of it have not. And the argument today really is, do you go around puncturing more bits of the bubble with the danger that you collapse everything too far and too fast, or do you extend and pretend and keep bits of the bubble going in the hope that it generates real activity and real profit and you trade your way out of it? That is always the dilemma. We're trying to manage the aftermath of a bubble. We're trying to deal with perceptions when perceptions have started to change in a negative direction. So if we look at how we got there, it is popular at the moment to say it's just wicked bankers. Now, I don't think it's as simple as that. I'm sure there are some wicked bankers. There are wicked people in all sorts of professions and activities. But I don't think bankers as a whole set out to cause enormous damage. They were part of a system. And I think just as there was obvious evidence of bad and rash banking in the 2004 to 8 period, I think there was very clear evidence of bad and rash central banking. They, after all, are meant to be the regulators, the callers of the tunes, the moderators of the amount of money. And I think there was clear evidence of poor banking regulation by the regulators. Why on earth do we have a large number of pretty well-paid banking regulators if they can't spot that kind of problem and put in the necessary measures to control it? So when we see the huge expansion of bank balance sheets in the run-up to 2007-8, we do need to ask not just why did the directors of those banks think that the normal rules of banking prudence were suspended, but why did the regulators regulating those banks think the normal rules were suspended? Because they allowed them to do it or even endorsed what they were saying. And we need to ask why the central banks provided the liquidity, the market assistance, so that they could perform like that. Now, when I was a financial regulator responsible for the non-bank financial services sector, I obviously kept in touch with the Bank of England who did the banks. And in those days, roughly, I think we thought anything over 20 times leverage was getting a bit too racy, and that you wanted to keep the average to 20 or below, and if you had a few outriders above the 20, you would be asking them very serious questions and getting them confidential discussions, of course, because you don't want to undermine confidence in the markets, to manage the position. We've been through a period when regulators have behaved very differently. They seem to like discussing it all with the media, which I think is a very dangerous thing to do if you're a regulator, and dragging it into the press, and so you undermine confidence if you have to make unpleasant comments on the people you're regulating. But at the same time as doing some of this negative copy in the media, they were allowing the UK banking system to have 34 times leverage. Now, why was it that people thought you could go from the old 20, which we thought was just about prudent, to 34 without any adverse consequences? Well, it's just like the tulip mania or the Japanese real estate. When people start saying the world has changed, you should ask some very serious questions. Sometimes the world does change. Sometimes it changes for the better, which is wonderful. But a lot of times it doesn't change as much as people think, or the old rules are not always as silly as they look. And just as people in Japan said, oh, well, we're so good now that we can afford these sort of property values, and just as they said, oh, our companies may be on 100 times earnings, but we account in different ways from America and Britain. You know, there's nothing wrong with us being on 100 times and you being on 15 times. You just make the adjustments and it's all fine. And you had highly paid analysts claiming that they weren't really on 100 times at all. So you had lots of people in 06, 07, in the regulators as well as in the banks, speaking off the common hymn sheet, saying, oh, it's all different. We now have such wonderful ways of managing and regulating risk. And these mega banks are so big that they've got this wonderful average portfolio. It can't all go wrong at the same time. So, you know, what does it matter if they've got a lot of risk on UK property? Because it's a small proportion of their total. That would be offset by the profits they make on commodity speculation in Hong Kong, and there is absolutely no problem with this. So you're very old-fashioned and stuffy, thinking you've got to keep the leverage down. We put the leverage up, and then we manage the leverage with all these wonderful new instruments. And so those great pioneers in Amsterdam who'd worked out how to detach trading the bulb from trading the instrument come into their own, and they have all their heirs and heiresses now with this great barrage of instruments, and they say they're risk reducing. Now, if you're very clever and swift of foot, I guess they can be risk reducing. I personally still get a bit worried if I see an investment fund which says it's 50% net long, and then I look at it and it's 550% long and it's 500% short. And they tell me, oh, it's a very low risk fund because it's got all this wonderful insurance in place. I say, what if? What if something went strange in the market so it was no longer balanced? What if you could close down one side but not the other? What if when you wanted to net the thing off, it didn't quite work? It just looks massively geared. And so you have to be careful that insurance and leverage reduction doesn't become leverage. Now, today, if you want to be really worried, let me ask you this question. Does it sound sensible that with a world economy of a little over 60 trillion, I'm not quite sure how much to add on to China recently, but call it around 60 trillion, has derivatives outstanding to the sum of 600 trillion? Do we really need 10 times the world economy to manage risk? And is that level of risk management really managing risk, or is it setting up another set of problems which could prove difficult to wind down or sort out if things got rough? Now, of course, I'm not an antediluvian. I think some of these risk management products genuinely do manage risk and could be very useful. How did they start? Well, if you're a farmer producing corn, it's a bit annoying if you only get money once a year when you manage to take the corn to market. You first of all start off with an agricultural market, and the farmer takes his corn, the buyers turn up, and there is an exchange. He gives the corn, the buyers give the money, and so the miller has his corn and they can go off and make the bread. But that was rather inconvenient, so farmers said, well, actually I'd like some money during the course of the year, so let me sell forward some of my corn. And the miller says, yes, well, actually I'd like to average my buying prices, and it might be a good idea if I could buy some forward as well when there's not much going on in the direct corn market. And so it was in both interests. And that was all absolutely hunky-dory, and the intelligent farmer and the intelligent miller found it reduced his risk, gave them better average prices. But as you can see, they can't both win. If the average miller was getting a cheaper price for his corn, the average farmer must have been trading badly in the futures market, or vice versa. But individual farmers and individual millers could benefit from this, and overall it shouldn't be damaging. But if you then say that on top of the miller-farmer transaction, you're going to have another 10 men and women trading the futures just for fun, and they don't want to go anywhere near the corn, they wouldn't be seen in a corn market, and they don't want to take delivery of the corn, but they're just going to trade the corn futures. Instead of reducing risk and reducing volatility, it could actually increase volatility. Because what you then might get is a mini bubble. And so you might get some quite powerful people coming along buying corn futures. And they say, we think the corn price is going up. So they buy their corn futures before they announce they think the corn price is going up. And then they tell the world, we're very clever people. We bought corn futures. We think they're going up. And then they find the second round of people who come in, yeah, you're probably onto the right thing. We trust him. We'll buy some corn futures. So they get the price up a bit. And then they call in the journalists and say, there's a big story here. We're getting horribly short of corn. And have you seen all these people buying up these corn futures? And how are they going to make enough corn to meet all these unsatisfied claimants on the corn market? So then you get a stream of articles saying, oh, there's going to be a corn shortage. And so then the third round come in and they start buying corn futures. And so it goes on. You've seen it, you've participated in it, some of you no doubt. And for an individual player, it can be sensible, benign, risk-reducing, wonderful, socially approved conduct. But if you do too much of it across the board, it can take off into bubble territory, and then you get this huge increase in volatility rather than risk reduction, and then you can get wealth destruction as it goes through the painful cycle of unrealistic expectations. When you get to the point where people write an article about 3 billion people are going to starve because of the state of the corn market, then maybe you should start to think it's getting a bit toppy. Let's hope it is, because we don't want to go into such a dreadful world. But you need to start thinking about where you are in that bubble cycle. Now, going back to our 06-07 problems, the crisis began with over-lending, particularly against property, in certain Western countries, United States of America, Spain, Ireland, United Kingdom to a lesser extent. And the over-lending against property had done a mini version of Japan. A lot of buildings were built in a country like Ireland or Spain that didn't ultimately have people who could afford to use them or live in them. Property values were carried up to pretty high levels. And in America, where they have a more efficient market, property values started coming down as soon as they switched the credit off after 07 and the top of the boom. That particular boom or bubble was burst or stopped by the sudden huge lurch by the central banks and the monetary authorities from a stance of over-easy money to a stance of over-restrictive money. So in a way, it was bad central banking, I think, that made that no longer feasible. You can still say the directors of the mortgage banks were wrong to lend all that money on mortgage. In America, they were encouraged to by their president, who wanted to get the mortgages out there into the hands of people who could scarce afford them for good social reasons, and the banks complied. And then suddenly the central bank says this is over the top, we're switching the money off, and a lot of mortgages were exposed, and the collapse began. But there were other features to the collapse that were already in place, and that is that the regulators of the system had decided that the highest quality paper of all was sovereign debt. Now, they hadn't done their homework or read their history books, because whilst it is true that in recent years in the West we have regarded Western sovereign debt as being of very high quality, and we have accepted it almost as good as money, and have allowed banks to use it as their big buttress, we surely had remembered that certainly Latin American sovereign debt had been rather tricky, and that in living memory we've had sovereigns like Argentina defaulting on their borrowings and creating a mini rumpus until people get over it and then say, well, now Argentina has a more realistic debt level, maybe we can go back to lending to them again. And there has been quite a long period when countries like that have had to pay rather more for their money. And surely we could have seen that other parts of the public sector in advanced Western countries had sometimes managed to borrow money as if they were a very high, very good grade credit risk, and then subsequently they turned out not to be, and so there have been quite a lot of losses in their particular bonds if there wasn't the state guarantee people wanted. But why did we accept that all this sovereign debt in the West was of such uniformly high quality? Because at the very same time when people had told all these banks not just to buy British and American sovereign debt, which is still fine at current market prices, but to buy Italian and Spanish and Greek and Portuguese sovereign debt, hadn't they thought about the ramifications of the Euro scheme they had unleashed? Because of course, in a way, Portuguese, Spanish, Greek, Italian debt is no longer sovereign debt. Why do we tend to trust sovereign debt more than your or my debt? Probably wrong to do so, but why do we? Well, for a couple of very good reasons. The sovereign has the power to demand repayment of the debts by the citizens on power of imprisonment and the use of force. And normally, people accept the right of the sovereign to demand the tax, and so they pay the tax. And so there is some comfort to know that you don't have to go out and persuade customers to buy more of your goods in order to repay your debt. You've got that right to demand that people pay up or go to prison, and they tend to prefer to pay up. Everything is relative. But there was also another feature to sovereign debt which no longer applies in Euroland, and that is that a sovereign not only has the power to distrain on everybody's money, but it also has the power to print the stuff. And so in a way, a sovereign should not normally fail to repay you. They may debauch and devalue the money they pay you back, but they can always technically pay you back in their money. They've often done this. Even very reputable sovereigns in the West have been quite happy to print and inflate away in order to make servicing their debt that much easier. So those were the two promises that meant that people had some reason to think that sovereign debt was different. The sovereign debt, so-called, of Euroland is now at best half sovereign debt because they have no power to print. They cannot choose how much of their money to have. They cannot choose what interest rate to sell it at, because this is now regulated for them by a central bank. So the position of Italy to Euroland is rather like the position of California to the United States of America. The Californian state has certain powers. It can raise its own debt, but of course it doesn't have the power to print, it doesn't control the dollar, it doesn't control the structure of dollar interest rates, so it's not a full sovereign, and it doesn't qualify, for example, for IMF funding programs because it isn't a full sovereign. It has to go through the US federal authorities. But our banking regulators and our bankers on the continent of Europe did not seem to understand that there had been this very material change in the nature of the deal, and that the only way now that a euro half sovereign has to get out of imbalances and difficulties is to play around with the debt, because they can't play around with the money. And that is why we've had the Battle of Greece, and why we're now in the early stages of the Battle of Italy, where it's important that the authorities win that battle for the euro if they're going to stabilize their currency, and we're all going to live happily ever after. So the Greek crisis has already reached the point where the authorities themselves think it is acceptable for a former sovereign within the euro area to say to banks that have lent it money, you're only going to get half back. I mean, who would have thought it? If you'd suggested that 10 or 15 years ago, I think you'd have been regarded as some kind of nutcase. This couldn't possibly happen in nice civilized society in Western Europe. But it has happened, it is happening. And the battle over Italy is how do you finance or refinance the huge mountain of Italian sovereign debt, 1.9 trillion euros by newspaper accounts, haven't checked the figure, a lot of money. How do you refinance it when the interest rate has gone through 6% for 10-year money? And I used to read that when it went through 6%, they'd lost the battle. Now today I read when it goes through 7%, they've lost the battle. These things fluctuate. Opinions are formed and reformed, and spin doctors spin. But at some point, if they don't get a grip on it and find a better way of financing the Italian state, there are serious problems for Italian state debt. So does one bubble lead to another? Well, one bursting leads to another would be my conclusion. And because they decided to tackle the private sector round of the crisis by more state debt finance solutions, they have set up the second round of the crisis, the sovereign debt and the half-sovereign debt crisis. So they made a couple of decisions in 2008 when they told us they'd save the world, which set up the 11-12 rolling crisis. The first decision was to tell the banks they had to lend a lot more money to these sovereigns, and they changed the capital rules to give them more credit for doing so. So they made sure that the banks were going to lose an absolute packet if the sovereign debt went wrong. And the second thing they did was they added to already extremely large debts and deficits in many cases the necessity to prop a series of banks with state money, and in many cases the nationalisation of the banks. Ireland didn't go bankrupt and go into special programme because the state was overspending. Ireland went into special programme because the ECB was no longer prepared to finance the Irish banks, and the Irish banks were too big for the Irish state. The United Kingdom now has an overall debt ratio of nearly 150% of GDP on the official consolidated figures where you add RBS to the stock of outstanding state debt. And that's what you would have to do in private sector accounting, and that's now what this new government has done for our public accounts, because they are now liabilities of the state to all intents and purposes. I was extremely sceptical about the wisdom of the states underwriting these extremely large global banks and all their derivatives and options and swaps. I didn't think it's really any of their business. I didn't think they could afford to do it, and I think it probably weakens the structure rather than strengthens it. I always favoured controlled administration. I'm very pleased that the new policies for any future bubble or crisis are to adopt controlled administration. But I'm not quite sure why they didn't carry it backwards and see if it works in practice, because they've still got plenty of these things to sort out, and I think the sooner they do it, the better. Japan didn't sort her banks out quickly and savagely, and she had a long period of difficulty, partly as a result. I hope we don't make the same mistakes, and I hope we understand that there are banking problems still to be resolved. So, can one bubble lead to another? Yes, it can. Can one slump lead to another? Unfortunately, yes, it can. And that is my worry today, that they spent too much on propping banks that are difficult to sustain, that they made the banks lend a lot of money back to the sovereigns. And we now have weak banks supporting weak sovereigns who support weak banks. And if you're in Euroland, the sovereigns aren't even sovereign. There is still something to learn from tulip mania.